All right, guys, hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today, we're going to be doing our part 2 of the United States Hegemony in its Perils series. Last episode, we discussed more specifically America's political hegemony. We discussed how the U.S. will abuse this political hegemony to, flout international law, to get special considerations for like diplomatic relations and international treaties, how they use this political hegemony to stage color revolutions and hide behind the guise of providing democracy in the world. So we touched on a lot of things there. It had a lot of sources to back up some of these claims coming from the memorandum from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. So this week we're going to be jumping back into that, but we're going to try to cover the other tenets that we didn't get to. There will be less sources for these, so we may be able to get through the rest of the document. If we start getting a little pressed for time, we may round it off and do one more third episode. But I do think if we stay on task here and just jump right in, we'll be able to get through it. So we're going to jump in here quickly to part 2 of this memorandum, and I'll pull up the screen share for you guys here. That is military hegemony or the wanton use of force. We'll go ahead and jump into the reading here, guys, and then we have still several sources that we're going to go through to try to, fact check some of the arguments being made by the Chinese Foreign Ministry and to just add a little bit more nuanced or analytical perspective. So jumping in here, guys, we have military hegemony, wanton use of force. The history of the United States is characterized by violence and expansion. Give me 1 second here, guys. Since it gained independence in 1776, the United States has constantly sought expansion by force. It slaughtered Indians, invaded Canada, waged a war against Mexico, instigated the American-Spanish War, and annexed Hawaii. After World War II, the wars either provoked or launched by the United States included the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, the war in Afghanistan, the Iraq War, the Libyan War, and the Syrian War. That's a lot of fucking wars, guys, and that's just the ones that are actually on the books. That doesn't count any of the CIA spook ops or coups or proxy wars, right? Abusing its military hegemony to pave the way for expansionist objectives. In recent years, the U.S. average annual military budget has exceeded $700 billion U.S. dollars, accounting for 40% of the world's total, more than the 15 countries behind it combined. The United States has about 800 overseas military bases, with 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. I mean, I had to stop there for a second just to double check that number. That's just huge. That is not a defensive force. That is a militarily aggressive offensive force. Yeah, the U.S. has spent $700 billion U.S. dollars annually. Now, that number is a bit of an understatement, as you might guess. I think I even did a video recently discussing insider trading within Congress in conjunction with the military-industrial complex. And in that, I thought that we've seen in the next 10 years that the military budget is expected to, surpass $1 trillion annually. And that does not include the sort of dark budget or the black budget, whatever the CIA is spending, the use of drug cartel money, smuggling money in order to finance some of these more, radical extremist groups, like jihadist groups and things like that, in order to destabilize countries, in order to, manufacture consent for interventions, all that kind of stuff. I mean, so, $700 billion, or as I said in a previous video, getting close to that $1 trillion annually mark. That's just what we know of. That doesn't cover everything whatsoever. But in this document here, it also discusses, let's see here, the 800 overseas military bases with 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. So this is literally an empire, guys. This is the definition of an empire. Why would the United States have 800 overseas military bases? Half of them, if not over half of them, nowhere near the United States. In fact, they are used to encircle Russia and China. Okay, that is an empire. And if you ever wondered why we don't have money for, new roads, a jobs program, why we can't have universal health care, why we can't, have universal higher education, why we can't have, subsidized child care, all this stuff. And if you ever, so actually quite literally, any problem you can think of in the United States, damn near, think about a problem. The root of the problem is that we don't use any of the government money, any of your tax dollars to go towards that problem to solve it. Because, a lot of times if you have enough funds, you can solve things, especially things like homelessness and malnutrition, right? The reason why we don't solve any of that is because we're upholding 800 overseas military bases and 173,000 troops overseas, right? That's an empire. Just like, go back if you've studied any history. I don't care what your politics are. You could be right wing or left wing. You have to realize that this doesn't work. Roman Empire, Persian Empire, Greek Empire, British Empire, Spanish Empire. How many of them do you got to see where what was the main problem? What was the main problem? They spent too much money on the military and were spread way too thin, and it ended up hollowing out their entire society until the point that the society didn't work anymore, and then the society broke down, and, the rest is history. But anyway, guys, let's just jump into a little source here. So we're talking about these 800 military bases in this foreign legion, literally. So I have this map and some statistics here from UBEAK, American Geographical Society. Map of the week, mapping the global U.S. military bootprint. So I just wanted to kind of show you guys this. Now, this actual diagram, or these diagrams in this map here, or graphs rather, are from Al Jazeera, but as we can see here, this is from the whole study, and the whole outlining of it is from UBEAK, American Geographical Society. So a Western source to kind of back up China's claims here, right, about the size of the American empire around the world. So let's just kind of look at this, see what we can see. So this says the U.S. has about 750 bases in at least 80 countries. So that number, military bases, fluctuates a lot. So we have, this is the lower end that I've seen, 750 bases in at least 80 countries. But I've seen as high as 900. Although I do think that 900 number was reeled back somewhat as we pulled out of Afghanistan in the last couple of years. Although I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those military bases that were in Afghanistan slowly start coming to, like Poland and Baltic states, right? Sorry about that, guys. So 173,000 troops deployed in 159 countries. So fact check there. So countries with the most number of U.S. bases, and you can kind of see here on the image with the key gray is 0. So gray is 0. Let's just look at this for a second, guys. Grayed out means that there are 0 U.S. troops. Dude, look how few gray spots there are on the map of the entire planet. 1 to 10. So I don't really know what, maybe that's, imagine just being the one U.S. soldier in like Chad or something. But 1 to 10, so I don't know, that's weird. But as you can see, there is a military bootprint essentially over 90% of the planet. Give me 1 second here, guys. I just want to check this, make sure it's working here. Okay. But countries with the most number of U.S. bases, this coincides with the countries with the most number of U.S. troops. Japan, Germany, South Korea. And then we have, Marshall Islands, Guam, and then a lot in the Middle East region, in that region. So, it makes sense. You can kind of see the outline of where some of these military bases and troop concentrations are. So, the border of Western and Eastern Europe to keep out the Russians, to mitigate their sphere of influence, right? And then over here, and we talked about this in the last episode, the policy of encircling China, trying to implement a precision strike missile system on the first island chain and an air defense system in the second island chain. So we can just see, this is, definitely fact check. The Chinese aren't being paranoid here. I mean, in South Korea, you have 73 bases and 26,000, almost 500 troops. Japan, you have 120 bases and about 54,000 troops. So, guys, these are literally occupying forces. And as we've seen, especially like in Europe, like you'd think that Europe is a sovereign series of states there. But as we've seen, that U.S. military footprint, bootprint, as they put it here, coincides with the, European Union's military-industrial complex really lining up through NATO, obviously, with the foreign interests of the American empire, right? So in a lot of ways, you could think of these as occupying forces, especially over here in South Korea and Japan. I mean, that's almost 100,000 troops and 200-something military bases. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know why this is popping up here. And if you have ever looked into, I should have actually pulled something up for this, but if you ever looked, it's not just like, oh, there's a military base here, and oh, maybe it brings some jobs, and it's not really that big a deal. No, these military bases are havens of crime, drug abuse, sexual assault. They're huge polluters. Obviously, as we know, the United States military-industrial complex, the U.S. military itself, is one of the biggest, I think actually the single biggest institutional polluter on the planet. So the military bases have, huge environmental footprint. I mean, all the time in Korea and Japan, you'll hear instances of rape, and the U.S. military oftentimes does everything it can to shield sexual assault predators from local authorities. You'll hear about creeks and riverways and natural landscapes completely polluted or destroyed by these military bases. You'll hear all kinds of instances of violence and drug abuse. I mean, this isn't just, go Google it right now. Like, Google U.S. military base crime, U.S. military base sexual assault. I mean, it just fills out. And these countries, while they're, bourgeois capitalist governments may be allied with the U.S. ruling class, many, you could even say in some of these countries, a majority of the people do not want these military bases here, especially in places like Okinawa and some of these communities around the DMZ in South Korea. They don't want it. They think Americans are crass. They think they're gangsterish. They have horror stories of, there's been instances of like children being ran over by military vehicles. These military bases do nothing but drain on the nation that they're in. And like I said, they're an occupying force, right? All right, guys, so let's go back to the memorandum here and do a little bit more reading to put some context in for our next sources. Says, as former U.S. President Jimmy Carter put it, the United States is undoubtedly the most warlike nation in the history of the world. That's coming from a United States president. You can find him quoted on that. That's Jimmy Carter, who, liberals give a lot of credit to, and like, I get it, I guess, kind of, because compared to some of these, white supremacist imperialist dogs, he's all right. Like, I think Jimmy Carter at the end of the day actually cares about his country, at least from an imperialist perspective. But like, don't get it twisted. The guy still did the bidding of the military-industrial complex and the imperial stooges. There are no good U.S. presidents. There are some that are maybe better than others, but U.S. presidents stand for the archstone of the empire of Western imperialism and capitalism. So like, let's not apologize for these people too much. You know what I'm saying? Going on here, 1776 to 2019, the United States undertook nearly 400 military interventions globally between those years. 400 military interventions between 1776 and 2019. 34% of which were in Latin America and the Caribbean, 23% in East Asia and the Pacific, 14% in the Middle East and North Africa, and 13% in Europe. Literally everywhere, all over the goddamn world, right? Yeah, so what's going on here? Since 2001, the wars and military operations launched by the United States in the name of fighting terrorism have claimed over 900,000 lives, with some 335,000 of them civilians, injured millions, and displaced tens of millions. The 2003 Iraq War resulted in some 200 to 250,000 civilian deaths, including over 16,000 directly killed by the U.S. military, and left more than 1 million homeless. So this is just in the United States' most recent string of wars. And, you know, I've read articles and I've read books and stuff about this. I mean, these are low-end estimates. These are conservative as all hell estimates of the death toll, of the human price tag of the U.S. empire in the Middle East alone. In the name of fighting terrorism, 900,000 lives. It's probably closer to millions. Tens of millions displaced. I mean, we cannot... You see these things and you see the talking heads blabbing about it on the news media, and you'll see imagery of bombs, but we're removed from it through the glass of the television screen or the smartphone screen. I don't think we can. There is no quantifying, or even qualifying, or qualitating, whatever the fuck the word is. There is no wrapping your head around the amount of human suffering this is. It's inconceivable, and quite literally, the United States is the fourth fucking Reich. But the thing is, it's an empire of lies. It's an empire that lives in the shadows. It's an empire hiding behind a highly complex propaganda machine, so that you do not see, or if you do see, you do not understand the scale of the atrocities. The way that the United States government has, particularly in the last 100 to 120 years or so, has operated is every bit as horrendous, egregious, inhumane, psychopathic, Machiavellian as the Third Reich was, as Nazi Germany was. That's not something that's up for debate. It's not a matter of your feelings. It's the truth. It's the truth. The only reason we look back with such horror on the Nazis is because they took colonialism, imperialism, and they flipped it inside out and did it inside of the imperial core, inside the imperial powers. They took what France, the United States, Germany, England, Spain had been doing in the rest of the world, where there are people of color living, savages. They took those policies and turned it inwards and did it to citizens living within Europe, i.e. Jews, i.e. Romani people, i.e. LGBTQ people, right? And yet, when we turn around and do the exact same horrors in the global south, even up until today with these wars, it's the same shit. It's crickets. That's because they're not part of the golden billion. They're not part of the quote-unquote white race, right? Anyway, I'm ranting here, guys. Let's go on. It says here, the United States has created 37 million refugees around the world. The 2 decades-long war in Afghanistan devastated the country. A total of 47,000 Afghan civilians and 66,000 to 69,000 Afghan soldiers and police officers unrelated to the September 11 attacks were killed in U.S. military operations, and more than 10 million people were displaced. The war in Afghanistan destroyed the foundation of economic development there and plunged the Afghan people into destitution. After the Kabul debacle in 2021, the United States announced that it would freeze some $9.5 billion in assets belonging to the Afghan Central Bank, a move considered as pure looting. Yes, that's what it was. It was looting. They painted that whole thing as we're keeping it out of the hands of the Taliban. But it's like, no, you just stole that fucking money and you used it for, I think they were talking about using it for the victims of 9/11. I mean, we are so far gone beyond the instance of 9/11. At this point, this war and these people fighting against U.S. occupation there had little to fucking nothing to do with the events of 9/11. That is another world that you're living in. But I mean, just look at these numbers, guys. you read these numbers and it doesn't register with you. You know, it's impossible for it to register with you. It's fucking numbers. It's not human faces. But imagine the part of the world that you're living in. Imagine your town, your city, your state. Imagine a war, bombs, grenades, soldiers on the street, killing, raping, looting. Imagine everything involving war. And then imagine what 10 million people being displaced would do. To put that in perspective, I live in Iowa. It's a rural state, flyover country. Corn country, boys. Right. My entire state has like 3 million people in it. So this would be, I can't even imagine if just in my state, everybody that lives in my state being displaced. And I imagine Afghanistan is only really maybe 2 or 3 Iowas combined in terms of size. I can't fathom it. It's unfathomable. That would be everyone in my state, everyone I know being displaced, being pushed into refugee camps, being starving. It's just crazy. Going on here, guys, though, with the memorandum, it says Turkish Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu, I'm sorry about the names, guys. You guys know I'm terrible at this. I try. Commented at a rally that the United States has waged a proxy war in Syria, turned Afghanistan into an opium field and heroin factory. It's true. Thrown Pakistan into turmoil and left Libya in incessant civil unrest. The United States does whatever it takes to rob and enslave the people of any country with underground resources. That is some fucking metal ass shit. I mean, you know, we always hear about Shen Weiwa on Twitter and shit about being an absolute masterclass in cyberbullying. Yo, I know this was the Turkish minister Süleyman here, but whatever team in China, whichever individuals are putting together this memorandum, y'all giving Shen Weiwa a fucking run for his money. I'll say that, okay? But yeah, I mean, look what we did to Libya. Look at what we've done to the borders in Pakistan. I mean, there's images of this. There's videos of this. There's books about it, about how this war in Afghanistan went, where it just, like it said here, it pretty much turned it into a giant opium field and heroin factory. And that war was such a colossal waste of time. Like, first off, if you go back into the history of the war in Afghanistan and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, all these groups that were supposedly there fighting a war on terrorism against, the U.S. cooked all this up with our good old boy Jimmy Carter here. Was a lot of the start of it with Operation Cyclone, where, you know, Afghanistan was having a, you know, somewhat more left-leaning bourgeois nationalist revolution where they were kind of throwing off the yoke of imperialism, and they were trying to develop a more, you know, social democratic society that was more equal, where women could go to school, where, you know, school was free, where they were going to do, you know, using the national resources to benefit the people, the nation as a whole, rather than, you know, in neoliberal corporations coming in to steal all of it and sell it off. Well, a lot of oil there, a lot of mineral resources, all this stuff. U.S. did not like that. And obviously there's geopolitical implications with, you know, it being in West Asia and being somewhat near to Russia, right? All this stuff. So the United States government did not like this. Well, you know, the U.S. is the empire of lies, is the empire of shadows. What did they come up with? They came up with Operation Cyclone, where they were dumping hundreds of millions, likely maybe billions of dollars under the Carter administration to religious extremist groups like the Taliban, like Osama bin Laden. I mean, the U.S. government straight up cut a check with Osama bin Laden's fucking name on it. And then all this meddling and fucking around and fighting the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan, it turned right around years later. And it turned into the, you know, Islamic extremism that we are dealing with today all throughout the Arab world and Africa. Right? And this is how the U.S. empire works. It's really beautiful the way that they'll cook up a enemy. And then they'll deal with that enemy as best they can, very They're not very good at it, it turns out. But the way that they'll deal with that current enemy is by some sort of series of consequences that creates another enemy as soon as that enemy is gone. And it's just amazing. It's just one enemy after another is created. We dealt with Osama bin Laden. We dealt with Al Qaeda. We dealt with all these groups. Suddenly there's ISIS. And if we get into that, that's a whole other story about how we funded that as well. I'm getting off on a tangent here, guys, but this is just how it works. Destabilized entire regions, destroyed lives, and then there's the next stage for the American empire, the next battle for them to wage, right? Going on here, guys, says the United States has also adopted appalling methods in war. During the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Kosovo War, the war in Afghanistan, and the war in Iraq, the United States used massive quantities of chemical and biological weapons, as well as cluster bombs, fuel air bombs, graphite bombs, and depleted uranium bombs, causing enormous damage on civilian facilities, countless civilian casualties, and lasting environmental pollution. So yeah, all this stuff here, guys. I would go so far as to say that the United States has, in terms of sheer volume and quality of violence, makes the Nazis look like a bunch of pushovers, right? Even the Nazis were hesitant to do the sort of carpet bombing that the United States military just uses shock and awe campaigns. There's a quote from, you guys know I'm terrible with names sometimes. I don't know exactly which U.S. military leaders it was, but they talked about they were dropping so much bombs in Europe and in the Pacific that they said, if we lose this war, we'll be going to The Hague for war crimes. And he said, yes, but we won't lose, or something like that. Vietnam War, the use of napalm, and I'm going to show you guys some stuff about this as well. The use of Agent Orange, where you've got children being born mutants with serious birth defects. But not just that, Vietnam is one of the most fertile, agricultural regions in East Asia, in the Far East, right? But the United States used so many weapons and so many chemical weapons that a huge portion of that agricultural land is completely unusable and will be unusable for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's such a beautiful country there, and the people are so kind and generous, and just horrible stuff. And then we know some of the stuff with like the war in Afghanistan and Iraq with like black sites. But anyway, guys, the horror that the United States has unleashed is, again, not to be a broken record, but something that we cannot picture. We cannot wrap our head around it, especially not using statistics. So I kind of want to go a different route. Instead of showing you statistics, I want to pull up a series of images, content warning, graphic images, depicting some of the horrors of U.S. empire. So I know some of you guys just listen to this like while you're at work or in the car, or maybe some of you are even streaming it from Spotify or Apple. So while I'm pulling these images up, I will do my best to describe them for you guys, for those of you who are just listening. But if you have access to the video, I'd go ahead and take a minute to actually watch if you're just listening, because I think it'll be, worth some of it for you guys. So I'll just go ahead and pull this first one up here. Okay, so these first few that I'm going to show you, let me just do a double check, make sure everything's working. It looks good. Okay, so these first ones that I'm going to show you are paintings that come out of North Korea. And, a lot of times these images are known, and they are painted in Western media as just being North Korean propaganda. Obviously, you guys know how lambasted North Korea gets for having this crazy propaganda machine. Okay, whatever. Every country has propaganda, yes. And sure, this is propaganda, but like we said in the previous episode, sometimes propaganda is an actual depiction of reality. Right. So in this image right here, we have a painting done in a classical style that depicts U.S. soldiers and a South Korean soldier pulling a woman tied to a cow with her breasts out there. Essentially, it's depicting her being pulled off as a spoil of war, right? To be used as presumably a sex slave. And now, yes, you could call this North Korean propaganda, but this is how the North Korean people and a lot of the South Korean people remember this war. It was horror beyond all horror. This is the war, like we talked about in previous episodes as well, where MacArthur talked about using 30 nuclear warheads, or bombs, rather. I guess they weren't warheads at the time. They were atomic bombs that you dropped out of planes. There's horrible stories about, like, in the refugee camps, American officers would offer to give refugees a double ration of rice if they would bring them a oxtail. Now, that sounds pretty well. An oxtail? What the hell is that? So the reason why they'd ask these people to bring them oxtails is because you'd have to go out and cut the tail off an ox. And if you know anything about barn animals, when you cut the tail off one of these animals, they can no longer stand in balance and they'll fall over and they won't be able to walk right. Okay, what do you think does all the tilling of the soil? Oxes, horses and things like that. So U.S. officers purposefully instigated famine and did whatever they could, like having people go out and cut off the tails off of oxes so that they would not be able to till the soil, so that they'd be reliant on U.S. imports for grain and things like that. So that's what this first image is. Let's see if I can pull up. And another thing, we have the South Korean soldier here. It may also be a Japanese soldier, because little known fact, obviously you probably know that Japan conquered the Korean Peninsula and had it as a colony for about, I want to say 20 or 30 years. It was for an extended period. But once Japan was defeated, the U.S. didn't kick the Japanese imperialists out of the Korean Peninsula. They actually kept them there and used them to help fight the communists in the early stages, both during and prior to the Korean War. And we all know the horrors of the Japanese imperialists. And, this picture here with the woman being hauled off as a spoil of war, makes me think of the comfort girls that Japanese imperialists were, notorious for. So I don't know if maybe it's that. But anyway, let's go on to this next image here. And again, guys, I'm sorry. A lot of these are very traumatic, horrifying images. So if you don't have the stomach for it, go ahead, skip ahead about 10, 15, 20 minutes. So for those of you listening, this first image you can see here, guys, is several American soldiers standing over a dead Korean man and a dead Korean woman. Looks like they have been shot by these American soldiers, and there is a small girl, probably about 4 to 6 years old, crying over her mother, and the American GI is about to shoot her, apparently. And again, is this North Korean propaganda? Sure, yeah, maybe. But there are plenty of stories told in American history books written by American authors of these horrors. There's one in particular, I actually should have pulled up the resource for it, a specific massacre where there were refugees coming to a U.S. Encampment that was specifically meant for a humanitarian corridor, and the officers gave orders to just shoot everybody that was coming down across the grass or the rice paddies there. So that's what we have here, guys. Horrifying image. Again, this is a painting. One more of this. Actually, no, wait. Don't I have another one here? I'm sorry. No, I don't have any more of the Korean ones. I thought I pulled up an extra. But this next one that we have here, guys, is a Pablo Picasso painting titled The Massacre in Korea, and I believe it was referring to that specific massacre that I was talking about. I apologize that I don't have the name of that specific instance, but you can look it up yourselves. So this is little known fact. Pablo Picasso was a communist, member of the Communist Party, and he was a rabid humanitarian and activist. And so this painting is called The Massacre in Korea. And It essentially has, it's a horizontal painting that essentially has two panels. There's two groups of people. On the left side, there are pregnant women depicted in the Picasso style. You know what Picasso paintings look like. So pregnant women with children. You have a young boy here on the left, it looks like, and on the right, there's a baby. And then on the right, you have soldiers depicted in an abstract fashion with guns, with swords, and some abstract-looking helmets about to gun these women and children down. So, again, you know, this is a man, Pablo Picasso, famous artist, world-renowned artist, considered one of the greatest artists in human history, depicting the horrors of American imperialism in Korea, right? Going on here, we're going to start getting into Iraq and Afghanistan. And these images here that I'm showing you guys are going to be coming out of Abu Ghraib, which I believe was in Iraq. Abu Ghraib was a black site, a military prison where there were thousands of images leaked out of U.S. soldiers committing every kind of atrocity you can think of. This first image I have here for those of you watching is a man in a body bag on ice. His eyes looks like essentially plucked out, and there is a woman here in a U.S. Army casual U.S. military uniform with gloves on her hand, smiling. And, you know, this image is just really disturbing to me, guys, because the smile on her face, this is really before the era where social media had taken off, but it really just shows the callousness in the human psyche and the sort of superficial culture in her face, of American culture in her face. And there's, just horrifying stuff. I'll move on to this next one, guys. This is a very famous image. You have probably seen or heard of it before for those of you listening. It is an American GI having a man on a leash. He's naked, dirty, laying on the ground, and she has a leash around his neck and is holding him. Horrible stuff. This next one depicts, these are all American soldiers again, mind you. 3 American GIs with 2 military dogs, keeping their military attack dogs just at bay from a man that is butt naked, covering his face. His penis is out. And this image really fucks me up, guys, because I kind of have this irrational fear of, when a dog is coming to greet you and they always nudge against your dick and shit. And I always I've had horror stories from when I was a kid of having dogs chase me, kind of growing up in a bad neighborhood like I did. And I have this horror phobia of even a nice dog just biting my dick off suddenly. So this fucking image here just really fucks me up, man. Horror story. So these are American GIs in Iraq, Abu Ghraib prison. Next, we're getting into some images out of Vietnam. This is another famous image. I'm sure you have seen it if you're anything of a history buff. It is the famous, quote-unquote, napalm girl. So this image on the left shows American GIs walking behind a series of children that have been napalmed. One of the children, the quote-unquote napalm girl in the center of the frame, has been torched completely. You can see how badly burnt she is with napalm. She has stripped out of her clothes. She is completely naked at the forefront of the camera to get the burning clothes off of her. In the right panel here, slightly smaller panel, is the woman, 70, probably 50 years, 60, 70 years later, with her burns. And the U.S. is notorious for being one of the only countries on earth that will still use napalm. It is banned by the Geneva Convention. Excuse me, guys. I'm pretty sure every country on earth has agreed to not use napalm. The U.S. has not. And if you don't know what napalm is petroleum jelly. Weaponized petroleum jelly. So, like Vaseline, it's kind of like that, but a lot worse. It is petroleum jelly that is dropped out of bombs that spreads and then ignites. So it'll burn the flesh off your bone, and it will completely, just torch you. It'll burn you to death. It's horrifying stuff, and you can't get it off because it's petroleum jelly and it like fuses with the skin and the flesh and the bone, right? Showing this next image here, guys, another famous image. These are South Vietnamese soldiers. So the U.S. propped up the South Vietnam government, and it was completely fascistic, dictatorial government. We hear all this horror stories about the North Vietnamese, but it was nothing like this. I mean, the way that the U.S. government did this is what they always do. They pick a minority group or a armed faction or this or that. And what they did is they took a more well-to-do French Catholic minority group in South Vietnam that had ties with the French colonialists when they were there, and they propped them up with Dien Bien Phu. And we can see here, this is presumably, they thought he was a, Viet Cong, that is a militia group working for the communists in the North. That's what they thought he was. And rather than have a military tribunal, they just pulled him off the side of the street and shot him in the head. But this is a regime backed by the U.S. government, right? Next one is also related to napalm out of Vietnam. We can see a older mother or grandmother, presumably holding a 1 to 2 year old baby boy. It looks like he is burnt all over his body with napalm. So again, this is the U.S. empire. Going into this next image here, we talked about Agent Orange and the way that it polluted Vietnam. There are still lasting effects to this day from Agent Orange. Actually, Johnny, you may remember John Boy, our former co-host with Entitled Millennials. His uncle, I believe, actually died, was a U.S. GI in Vietnam. He recently died from cancer complications from Agent Orange application. And we'll hear a lot of those stories here in the U.S. And I talked about how Agent Orange and other chemicals and other armaments made a lot of the agricultural base areas of Vietnam completely, essentially irradiated, right? But it's done more than just make it unable to plant crops and things there. This image here is, I guess, several generations now down the line from the use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. This is a child born with a coned head. I may be mistaken. I'm not a doctor, obviously. I'm a YouTuber. I think some of these children are born without large parts of their brain. I think there's sometimes children that are born with essentially just like the brainstem and the medulla oblongata, like the parts of the brain that are needed to like breathe and eat. Like you pretty much are like, a lesser organism at that point. Like you don't have any of the higher functionings of the human brain, just the stuff that makes you alive, like living, not actually alive, right? So these are some of the birth defects that are happening years later from the chemical pollution. Just horrifying stuff. I'm going to close that out for you guys. So this is the face of the American empire. This is what it actually looks like. This is what it actually does. All right. Completely horrifying stuff, guys. Let's see. Where do I want to go into next here? I guess we'll be moving on to this next segment. We're doing pretty good on time. So I'll pull this back up for you guys. This next segment, hopefully you can see it, is number 3, economic hegemony. That is looting and exploitation. After World War II, the United States led efforts to set up the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which together with the Marshall Plan formed the international monetary system centered around the U.S. dollar. By taking advantage of the dollar's status as the majority international reserve currency, the United States is basically collecting seigniorage. Seigniorage is like when the mob comes in and says, hey, you're either going to pay us a percentage of your chips that you're selling, or we're going to beat your head in and burn your business down. Right. Sorry, Italian-American viewers. I didn't mean to make a racial trope. But anyway, So that's essentially what they mean by the seigniorage. From around the world, in using its control over international organizations, it coerces other countries into serving America's political and economic strategy. So some of the stuff you guys may have heard of, the Bretton Woods system that was, using the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency backed by gold. Eventually that fell apart in the 1970s, and then it became the freely flowing fiat currency that we associate with the American dollar today, backed by the petrodollar. That is Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab countries agreeing to do all trade in petroleum and oil in the U.S. dollar, which means all the countries around the world had no choice but to have a large amount of American dollars, which in turn meant that they said, well, why don't we just do all our trade in American dollars because we already have so many of them, blah, blah, blah. International Monetary Fund, which of course gives, in the World Bank, gives loans to other countries, but for development, ostensibly, and things like that, humanitarian aid, but of course puts them into debt with the United States government and other Western financial corporations out of Europe. And then the Marshall Plan, a little bit of a backdrop on that. That was the U.S. policy of rebuilding Western Europe and rebuilding a few countries in East Asia after the war. And now it's painted in our history books as if it was some great America doing the right thing. But it was really a policy of containment. The idea was to put, developed, prosperous, capitalist countries, capitalist economies and governments on the borders or near in the vicinity of communist countries. So that's why Japan was given tons of money to redevelop, became a capitalist powerhouse in the post-World War era. Same with South Korea, and then obviously West Germany, the countries in Western Europe. This was done, one, as a propaganda machine to tell the rest of the world that was kind of going through this process of deciding if they'd be socialist or capitalist. Like, oh, look, see how much better the capitalist countries are doing. But the part that's always left out of this is, the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries, China, North Korea. And then North Korea obviously suffered the Korean War as well, right on top of this. These countries were completely destroyed by war, and they did not have a Marshall Plan. That is the U.S. government dumping tens of billions of dollars into their society to help them rebuild. They had to do it on their own, and from countries that a lot of them were still just coming out of a feudal and imperial stage of development. Right. So there's some back history here for you guys. Getting into this a little bit here, talking about how the United States government upholds its economic hegemony here, and then we'll have some sources to add more perspectives to it. Says here, it costs only about 17 cents to produce a $100 bill, but other countries had to pony up $100 of actual goods in order to obtain one. It was pointed out more than half a century ago that the United States enjoyed an exorbitant privilege and deficit without tears created by its dollar, and used the worthless paper note to plunder the resources and factories of other nations. So, yeah, it costs 17 cents to print a $100 bill. It doesn't cost. It probably costs less than that now in the digital age, where it's all just fabricated numbers on a screen. But because of the petrodollar, because of the fact that the global economy uses the United States dollar as a reserve currency, it has a sort of false credit to it, a false guarantee that it's worth something, right? Because everyone's using it. I mean, when everyone's using something, you say, oh, it must be worth something, right? So what this amounts to essentially is that the U.S. government can just print dollars out of nothing, out of thin air. No one's going to stop them. That's why our debt's so high, is because everyone thinks that the American dollar is worth something. So we can just keep printing it, and we can give them this worthless dollar bill or this worthless number on a screen, and they have to give us actual goods. They have to give us actual French wine. They have to give us, actual, Japanese video games. They have to give us, actual South American lithium, et cetera, et cetera. So we give them fake money that's worth nothing, not backed up by anything other than the America's good credit as having the world reserve currency, and they have to give us actual stuff worth actual value, right? So pretty crazy. This is how the U.S. has been able to, borrow money endlessly to uphold its overseas military bases and things like this. It's essentially robbing at gunpoint in a lot of ways the rest of the world. That's that seigniorage. It's like the mob. That's why some scholars will refer to the United States government and military as the Godfather, right? Famously, more recently, Vijay Prashad and Noam Chomsky's collaboration book, right? Let's do a little more reading here, and then I'll kind of hop into some of this here. Let's see. Okay. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States abused its global financial hegemony and injected trillions of dollars into the global market, leaving other countries, especially emerging economies, to pay the price. Turned to aggressive interest rate hikes, which we're seeing now, causing turmoil in the international financial market and substantial depreciation of other currencies such as the euro, which we've seen the euro is worth roughly the same or less than the dollar now, which has not been seen in quite some period, many of which have dropped to a 20-year low. As a result, a large number of developing countries were challenged by high inflation, currency depreciation, and capital outflows. This was exactly what Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, John Connally, once remarked with self-satisfaction yet sharp precision, that the dollar is our currency, but it is your problem. So what is this, guys? This is crazy because it essentially, we always hear the U.S. talk about sovereignty and, self-determination, things like this. But because of the United States' position as a global reserve currency around the world, whatever we do for our own domestic monetary or financial policy, that is interest rate hikes with the Federal Reserve, the printing of more money through the Federal Reserve or through the Treasury, it affects everybody else disproportionately in the world. And a lot of times our monetary policy will affect countries in the third world or whatever more than it will affect us because, the United States economy is so large as compared to these developing countries that a 0.25% interest rate hike from the Federal Reserve is enough to just completely, destroy a country in the global South that's, got so much of their surplus value tied up in U.S. banknotes, right? That's just some of this here, guys. And now, just to kind of fact check this and give you some more perspective, I'll pull up the next thing. I have this article from the Brookings Institute by Ben Bernanke, pretty notorious name here. The dollar's international role and exorbitant privilege. So just some more perspective here, guys, to sort of fact check and add the realization that, the Brookings Institute is a Western source, just to show you that this isn't just Chinese propaganda. This isn't just even the global South saying these things about the United States. There's Western analysis and educational sources backing it up. So we have this highlighted section here. It says, the goal was to replace the gold standard, talking about the Bretton Woods and the advent of the petrodollar, which had collapsed during the Depression, with something more flexible. In practice, however, the system afforded the greatest flexibility to the United States, which enjoyed substantial freedom to pursue its domestic policy objectives, as well as the ability to run sustained balance of payments deficits. That's what we were talking about, where the U.S. can just keep running up debt. It doesn't matter because everyone uses the dollars, so they're always worth something. Its value's artificially inflated compared to its economy, which industrially speaking is actually hollowed out, not worth that much. The latter, according to French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, sorry, Frenchman, gave the United States an exorbitant privilege. The Bretton Woods system ultimately broke down in part because the U.S., as the anchor country, didn't live up to its obligation to maintain price stability, that is, having the dollar backed up by gold. Since the early 1970s, the international monetary system has been effectively decentralized, with each country setting its own exchange rate framework and with the values of other major currencies being determined by markets. But that's something of a misnomer, that last sentence, because in the end, the U.S. dollar is used in so much global trade. We're starting to see it change now with de-dollarization. But again, just some information from the Brookings Institute to kind of outline it. Going back to the memorandum, though, here, guys, I have a little bit. We want to talk about the IMF and the World Bank and their sort of role in cementing American power, cementing neocolonialism, right? So let's see here. Okay, so the next segment here, guys, says United States imposes additional conditions to their assistance to other countries in order to reduce obstacles to U.S. capital inflow and speculation. The recipient countries are required to advance financial liberalization and open up financial markets so that their economy's policies would fall in line with America's strategy. So that's what this is like the U.S. will purposefully tank commodities markets. They will, purposefully set up countries in the third world to fail by not allowing them to develop their country. The loans that they do get in the initial period are not stuff to meaningfully, update infrastructure or meaningfully develop production. Instead, it's just used to kind of keep a tab on things, keep things running, so they continue to be a export, raw commodity export economy. Obviously, this isn't going to cut it, so then they default on those loans, and then when they come back for another loan, the U.S. is like, well, okay, but you're going to have to privatize your minerals, you're going to have to privatize your gas, you're going to have to privatize your agriculture, you're going to have to privatize this, and that. And then what happens is, in order to get that loan from the IMF and get more debt, U.S. corporations, Western corporations will swoop in and reap the rewards, right? And this is backed up by that political hegemony and that military hegemony, where if you don't agree with this or you get a guy in that's like, no, we're not going to do this, we see what happens, color revolution, coup, assassination, blah, 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 right? But we do have a little bit of information about this, specifically from the Harvard Political Review. So Harvard Political Review, a Western source to back this up a little bit. It says, when countries come into significant debt, the IMF can provide loans and pooled funds from its members' country quota system to deter governments from squandering this capital. However, the IMF makes almost all of its loans conditional. That is, each loan is contingent on countries implementing the conditions outlined in the IMF's structural adjustment programs. That's what we're talking about, structural adjustment. That's a fancy word for neoliberal shock therapy, privatize your entire economy, outsource everything to private corporations. Alternatively known as SAPs, they aim to increase capital inflow so that the countries have the means to recover from debt and are unlikely to default on their loans. Common asks of the IMF include austerity measures such as tax increases coupled with budget reductions, and the tax increases aren't on wealthy people. They're on working class people. Coupled with budget reductions in sectors like infrastructure, research and education, financial liberalization policies like reducing trade restrictions, privatization of state-run corporations, measures to increase government accountability and transparency, programs that increase a country's export and resource mining levels, and the reduction of price regulations and unions. So again, yes, just a little bit more information coming from Harvard Political Review. I'm pretty sure Harvard Political Review is not a cutout of the Chinese Foreign Ministry or Chinese Communist Party, is it? Well, guys, I do have a little bit less, or a little bit more I want to talk about. Let's go ahead and just polish off the last of this reading from the memorandum for this section, and then as we get into, we'll do the technological hegemony, monopoly, and suppression in a final episode, and it'll be a much shorter one than these ones, but we'll do this as a three-parter. Because, guys, I'm running out of steam. I'm trying to bring the energy, trying to bring the nice reading voice. But your boy's running out of steam here. So let's see here. Because this last part will grease the wheels for this technological hegemony. Anyway, get into some of our discussion about the ways in which the U.S. abuses the free market in order to ensure that its corporations remain on top and suppress other countries from being any more than commodity developers. They, keeping them deindustrialized, keeping them out of the competitive market for things like high technology. So we'll go ahead and read here, guys. Let's see here. The United States willfully suppresses its opponents with economic coercion. The United States leveraged its hegemonic financial power against Japan and concluded the Plaza Accord. As a result, yen was pushed up, and Japan was pressed to open up its financial market and reform its financial system. The Plaza Accord dealt a heavy blow to the growth momentum of the Japanese economy, leaving Japan to what was later called the three lost decades. America's economic and financial hegemony has become a geopolitical weapon. Statistics show that U.S. sanctions against foreign entities increased 933% from 2000 to 2021. United States had or has imposed economic sanctions on nearly 40 countries across the world, including Cuba, China, Russia, the DRPK, Iran, and Venezuela, affecting nearly half of the world's population. That's half of the world's population being under unilateral U.S. sanctions. And if you think that sanctions are some nice way of trying to get a country to do better to its people, it's not. It's economic warfare and results in millions around the world, millions of preventable deaths, right, or deaths of excess. This is a serious departure from the principles of liberal market economy that the United States has long boasted. So the U.S. always talks about the free market, forces, as we saw with the IMF and World Bank loans, forces liberalization on other countries, but it does not toe the line with that for itself. It's always protectionism, protecting U.S. corporations from foreign competition. And, this next episode that we're talking about is going to get into that, how these sanctions, how these trade coercions uphold American technological hegemony in high tech. And we're going to be discussing specifically the Fairchild deal, trade war, when chips were down, how the U.S., as we saw with this segment here, leveraged its economic financial power against Japan and concluded the Plaza Accords. And how, remember how everything used to seemingly be made by Japan and, Sony PlayStation and sound systems and TVs, and now it's like not. So we're going to get into how the U.S., in conjunction with like the CIA, every layer of the U.S. government in political and economically shutting down Japanese industry as a competitor. So we're going to get into that next episode, guys. So without further ado, I guess we'll kind of try to round it off here a little bit. I hope I've covered some of this, guys. The abuse of military hegemony around the world, the scale and size of the U.S. empire, the amount of troops there are around the world, occupying troops really around the world, the effect some of these military bases have on, native populations anywhere from Japan to Germany. I hope that I've unfortunately been able to show you some of the atrocities that the American empire imposes on people and kind of begun greasing the wheels, at least, for a conversation about how the U.S. empire maintains economic hegemony and, extrapolates global wealth at not just gunpoint, but at the point of a signed document at the bottom line, right? So without further ado, guys, I'll go ahead and round this off here. As always, it's great hanging out with you and all that. Remember, you can support my independent media work on Patreon at patreon.com/entitledmillennials. You can support me there for $1 a month. $1 a month. You get early access. You get behind the scenes. I do exclusive posts on there, sometimes personalized posts. Patrons get a thank you at the end of every single episode. And patrons also get, direct community influence. They get to have a say in the way that content is produced, what kind of content they want to see produced. And also, guys, remember, I am in between jobs right now. I'm struggling to find a job that's actually going to be sustainable while I try to do this full time. I want to stay focused on this. Guys, you guys have put so much positive reinforcement in. It just really makes me realize I can do this full time if I put the time in. So I've been trying to find another job, but it's been hard making ends meet. You know how the economy is right now. So if Patreon's maybe not your thing, you can make one-time donations at paypal.me/entitledmillennials. That's greatly appreciated. I mean, you guys made the ends meet last month, literally. So that's amazing, guys, and I thank you so much for that. So we'll go ahead and close it down. Look forward to part 3 of the United States Hegemony and its Perils coming at you next week, guys. And until then, as always, it's great hanging out with you. I love you very much, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.